Welcome. My name is Galen Barbos. I'm with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I am joined here by my colleague, Naeem Dargouth, and we're excited to share with all of you today some highlights from the latest edition of our annual Tracking the Sun report. Before we begin, let me just run through the standard housekeeping items. So first is that the webinar is being recorded, and we'll post a recording online within the next day or two. Number two is that we'll have time for some question and answers at the end. All of you should hopefully see a Q&A button somewhere on your screen. So I would definitely invite and encourage you to enter in questions as we go. Naeem will be in the background kind of organizing those in advance of the Q&A session. And so it would be great to have a nice queue ready to go before we get to the Q&A. And then last but not least, I wanted to draw all of your attention to the web address at the bottom of the slide here, trackingthesun.lbl.gov. That is the website where you can find the report, as well as various supporting elements, including the public data set, a narrative summary, an executive summary, and as well as links to the webinar recording once we get that posted as well. So with that, let's begin. So some of you may already be familiar with this report. We've been doing it for, I don't know, maybe, gosh, 16 or 17 years now, I suspect. But for those who are new to Tracking the Sun, the purpose of this annual report is to describe trends in the prices and other characteristics of grid-connected distributed solar and distributed solar plus storage systems in the United States. This latest edition of the report focuses on projects installed through the end of last year and is accompanied by a companion report that our colleagues at Berkeley Lab publish that's focused on utility scale solar. And so this report focuses on smaller distributed scale systems. The other forthcoming utility scale report focuses instead on larger utility scale systems, and I'll, in a couple slides, explain how we draw the distinction between those two classes. This report, as I mentioned, is accompanied by several other data products described in the text box on the lower right-hand side here. That includes a narrative executive summary, a data visualization tool, and the public data file as well. And so I encourage all of you to go and check out those items as well. I'll also just call your attention to a few new items that we added to this edition of the report. This includes data related to roof coverage ratios, as well as more granular customer segmentation data for both residential and non-residential systems. And so I'll be sure to focus and highlight those when we get to that material. So in brief, this is the set of topics covered in the report, and I'll be going through all of these today. I should mention that our report is a PowerPoint slide deck, and the slides that I'll be walking through today cover pretty much everything in the report itself. Some of the upfront material I'm going to skip over, but otherwise all of the key quantitative trends that are in the report we'll also try to quickly get through during the webinar here today. So very quickly on some of the kind of background material, I mentioned this report focuses on distributed PV and PV plus storage systems. Throughout some of the slides, you'll see that we distinguish between residential and non-residential systems. And in many cases, we further break the non-residential systems into small versus large, where we use 100 kilowatts as the cutoff between those two groups. The residential systems, just to be clear what those include, we include roof-mounted systems of any size, as well as ground-mounted non-residential systems up to 5 megawatts AC. Anything above 5 megawatts AC is considered utility scale, and that is included in our colleagues' companion report on utility scale solar. The data that we collect for this report come from a whole variety of different sources. It's project level data, so individual distributed PV systems. This year's report includes data on 3.7 million individual systems installed through the end of last year. That covers just about 80%, 78% of all systems in the US installed up until that point in time. And about 550,000 systems installed just last year. As we get to the installed price trends later on in the deck, that material is based on a smaller subset of our sample, really just the set of systems where we have complete and reliable information on installed prices. And you can see that represents a little bit below half of all of the systems in our data set overall. Now, comparing on a state-by-state basis between our data sample and the overall market, I just want to make a couple points here. The first is that our sample, like the overall market, is pretty heavily dominated by California. So about half of all of the systems in our sample are from California, and that more or less corresponds to the overall market. And so throughout the deck at various points, I will draw particular attention to some of the numbers for California, really as a way of sort of illustrating how some of the national trends may be really driven by California, and in some cases contrast the trends in California with what's happening in other states. But that's just something to be aware of. In terms of kind of the completeness of our data and where the gaps exist, in general, our data set has pretty strong coverage in all of the large state markets. Where I would say we have kind of the most incomplete coverage is in kind of the smaller markets. And you can see that in the light blue or light gray bar segments at the top of these stacked bars. Those are kind of the amalgam of all of the different small states around the country. So that, to the extent that there's a bias or a skew in our data, it's that those smaller state markets are somewhat underrepresented. So just wanted to be clear about that. So, excuse me. With that, let's get into some of the trends, and we're going to focus here on describing some trends in just the characteristics of PV systems installed throughout the US. And so we're going to start with trends in system size. You can see that residential systems have been getting steadily larger over time. And as we'll talk about in a couple slides, that one of the big drivers for that has been the steady increase in module efficiencies. The trends for non-residential systems shown in the bottom chart are a little bit more irregular. You can see first that we've included two different lines in that chart, one for the trend in the median system size and another for average system size. And we do that because the distribution and system sizes in the non-residential sector is very non-normal, which is to say there's a very large upper tail to the distribution. And so that's why the average is quite a bit higher than the median. But suffice to say, the majority of non-residential systems are actually quite small, as indicated by the median size of just 26 kilowatts last year. But there are quite a few larger systems out there, and that's what pulls the average size up. In terms of trends over time, you can see that there was a period kind of in the middle of the time period shown here when we saw kind of a proliferation of larger non-residential systems, and that's indicated by that growth in the average system size and the growth in the upper band in the percentile range. But over the last decade or so, system sizes in the non-residential sector have been pretty flat, notwithstanding that little blip in the average system size that we saw a couple years ago. Here's where we compare system sizes across states, and you can see quite a bit of difference from state to state. One particular trend I would note here, again, going back to the fact that California is really a large part of the sample, is that system sizes in California tend to be relatively small. compared to other parts of the country. And so you can see in the upper chart, California is, I guess, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th state from the left-hand side. Median sizes there were about 6.6 kilowatts last year, but in most states, typical system sizes were above 7, and in many cases in the kind of 8 to 10 kilowatt range. On the non-residential side, really the most kind of pronounced differences that you see across states is in the upper end of the system size range, where you can see some states on the right-hand side of the figure there, where there's just a much greater prevalence of large non-residential systems. In some cases, these are states with relatively sizable community solar programs, at least relative to their overall non-residential market. And so there's kind of a particularly large share of systems are large in those states. So I mentioned module efficiency trends. Here we can see how median module efficiencies in the upper charts have been growing steadily over time. That reflects both the increasing prevalence of monocrystalline modules, as shown by the dashed line. Those represent nearly 100% of the market, as well as other evolutions in module technology over time. And one of the significant sort of implications of this growth in module efficiency is that it allows for denser installations. You can fit more kilowatts into a given square footage, and that can be particularly important in space-constrained applications, as many residential systems are, where you're dealing with kind of a defined roof area, often shading and obstructions and various different roof plane orientations. And so having more efficient modules allows for larger systems, more kilowatts within a limited amount of physical space. And you can see in the lower chart here how module efficiency growth and system sizes really track each other quite closely. This is in the residential sector, and that very much suggests that the growth in module efficiency has been really one of the primary drivers in enabling larger system sizes for residential customers. Roof coverage ratio. This is a new feature that we added to the report this year. Roof coverage ratio represents the percentage of available roof space occupied by the PV system. This is something that we were able to develop this year by bringing in data from a company called CoreLogic, which includes square footage information, and we were able to use that in order to calculate roof coverage ratios for each individual system in the data set, and then based on that show the trends displayed here. And what you can see is that in the residential sector, roof coverage ratios, they typically range from kind of, roughly 20 to 40% of total roof area. They tend to be larger for multi-story homes. And that's because in multi-story homes, you typically have smaller roof area for a given amount of living square footage. And they've also been pretty flat over time, and that just further kind of supports this hypothesis that the growth in module efficiencies has really been what has been driving increases in residential system sizing. For non-residential systems, roof coverage ratios are much more variable from project to project, and that just reflects the greater diversity in different building types and system configurations. Inverter trends here we show on the top the growth in market share of module level power electronics. That includes both microinverters and DC optimizers. And you can see for residential and small non-residential systems that really the vast majority, almost all systems installed last year included either one or the other form of module level power electronics. You can also see how the relative share of microinverters versus DC optimizers has been changing over time. And in the last few years, we've seen that the market share for microinverters has really been growing quite rapidly. For large non-residential systems, the market shares are much lower, particularly for microinverters, virtually non-existent within that sector. But you can see this growing adoption of DC optimizers within that market segment. The figures on the bottom show trends in inverter loading ratios. So this is the ratio of the module nameplate capacity to the rated inverter capacity, or the DC to AC ratio, as it's sometimes called. And you can see for both residential and non-residential systems, those inverter loading ratios have been growing over time. That partially reflects declining module costs, which sort of tilts the economics towards having more DC capacity for a given amount of inverter capacity. It also reflects increasing market shares for microinverters, as systems with microinverters tend to have higher ILRs. Lastly here, in terms of system characteristics, we show trends in mounting configuration and panel orientation. So in the figures on the top, you can see for large non-residential systems, just under half of all of systems installed last year were ground mounted, and about 9% had tracking equipment. Those percentages are significantly lower for small non-residential systems and are almost non-existent for residential systems. The figures on the bottom show trends in panel orientation. And this is potentially significant from the perspective that utilities around the country are increasingly adopting time of use pricing, often with peak periods in the late afternoon hours. And all else being equal, we would expect that trend might be accompanied by a greater tendency to install west-facing panels. In fact, we haven't really seen much of that, at least over the past 8 or 10 years or so. You can see in the figure on the lower left that the distribution and panel orientation has been pretty consistent in recent years. Little over half of all systems are oriented southward. About a quarter of systems are pointed to the west, and then the remainder mostly to the east, or are flat or north-facing in some cases. So I'm going to now turn to talking a little bit about the characteristics specifically of paired PV plus storage systems. And we'll start by just looking at trends in attachment rate. So this is the percentage of PV systems installed each year with storage. You can see in the figures on the top that these attachment rates have been growing steadily over time. For residential systems, about 12% of all new residential installs in our sample last year had storage, and about 8% for non-residential systems. In the figures on the bottom, you can see how those attachment rates vary across states. Hawaii, as has been the case for many years, is in a class of its own. Virtually all new PV systems installed in Hawaii include storage. California is also an important market for paired PV plus storage systems. We'll talk a little bit more about California in the next slide, but 14% of systems in the state last year had storage. Most other states are somewhere in the 4 to 10% range, at least for the residential sector. And then on the non-residential side, you can see also quite a bit of variation, but many states have quite low attachment rates, below 2%. And often really it requires some kind of explicit policy or programmatic support to drive paired solar plus storage adoption in the non-residential sphere. So as I mentioned, I'm going to provide a little bit more detail here on California, looking at attachment rates there. I will just mention the footnote at the bottom of the slide here and point you towards a study that we put out earlier this year that really digs more in depth into some of the trends in California over the last year. But here we're just looking at storage attachment rates. And as some of you, probably many of you may know, California is in the midst of a pretty significant transition away from net metering to a new incentive structure called net billing. The defining feature of net billing is that PV generation that is exported to the grid is compensated at a much lower rate than the customers to install storage so that they can basically absorb PV generation, but then use that to meet their own load later in the day. And you can see that the market is kind of slowly shifting to net billing. As that has happened, storage attachment rates have been rising. The light green line in the figure at the top shows storage attachment rates for systems installed under the new net billing tariff. And you can see that those attachment rates are now up in the kind of 60% range. That compares to about 10% of systems installed under net metering. And so as the market progressively shifts to this new net billing structure, the overall attachment rate in the state is steadily increasing. On the non-residential side, we haven't seen such a big change, at least so far in California. And to some extent, that's just due to the fact that still most non-residential systems in the state are being installed under the legacy net metering tariffs. And so we may see more of a shift as the net billing tariffs become more prominent in the non-residential sphere. So this slide here shows a lot of different information related to sizing of paired residential paired PV plus storage systems. I'll just quickly walk through the figures here. The one on the upper left shows the distribution in storage sizes for paired residential systems installed last year. And we show distribution both in the KW, the power rating of the storage units, as well as their kilowatt hour storage capacities. And you can see that most paired residential systems consist of a 5 kilowatt battery with either 10 or 13.5 kilowatt hours of energy storage capacity. That just really corresponds to kind of the sizing that is offered by most of the commercial residential battery providers in the market today. Given kind of those sizing conventions, storage durations are either 2 hours, or in the case of the Powerwall, which is the 13.5 kilowatt hour battery, that's got 2.7 hours of storage. But in general, you're looking at somewhere between 2 and 3 hours of energy storage duration. The figure on the lower left shows trends in storage sizing over time. And you can see there that at least up until a certain point recently, there was this steady trend towards larger storage systems among residential adopters. And that I at least attribute to growing use of these systems for backup power applications, where having more storage capacity allows a customer to ride through a longer duration outage. That trend is kind of more or less reversed, or at least kind of stalled over the past couple of years. And that may simply be due to just the market kind of broadening and perhaps backup power no longer being as prominent of a driver of adoption as it was a few years ago. Here we show some similar data, but for the non-residential sector, looking at trends in paired non-residential systems. I think that I'll just really quickly go through this and highlight a couple points. First, looking at the figure on the upper left, storage sizes for non-residential paired systems, they vary quite a bit. It's much less uniform than in the residential sector, but still you can see most of the storage systems are relatively small. You're talking about primarily 5 and 10 kilowatt storage systems, with usually, less than 30 kilowatt hours of storage. You can see in the figure on the lower left how the market has really been moving over time towards smaller and smaller storage systems. And to be clear, that's not because storage is because customers are wanting smaller systems as much as the market is really migrating towards smaller non-residential customers who themselves have smaller storage needs. So quickly, I'm going to turn here to trends in third-party ownership and some customer segmentation trends. The figure on the top shows the share of adoptions each year that are third-party owned. And you can see, looking at the residential numbers, that there was a very precipitous and steady decline in third-party ownership, dating back to about 10 years ago when the market was at its peak. That steady decline really shifted this last year. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but 2023 was the first year in about a decade that we saw third-party ownership rates rise in the residential sector. And that may be the result of a couple factors. Interest rates rose, which has made third-party ownership potentially a little bit more attractive relative to loan financing. But in addition, the Inflation Reduction Act includes various bonus incentives that are available for third-party owned but not host-owned residential systems. And so we might be seeing the beginning of some shift back towards third-party ownership as a result of those incentives. The figures on the bottom show differences in third-party ownership shares across states. And you can see quite a bit of variation there. In some states, TPO rates last year were up around 50% in the residential sector. And those tend to be states with relatively high incentives, either high solar renewable energy certificate prices or other relatively lucrative incentive programs. Here's some new data that we introduced into the report this year, where we try to provide a little bit more granularity in terms of the underlying customer segmentation of solar adopters. So in the figures at the top, which focus on residential, the pie chart shows something that we all probably already know, which is that the vast majority of residential systems are being installed on single-family detached homes. Among that small slice that consists of something other than single-family detached, most of those are some sort of small multifamily buildings, or a duplex or a triplex, or a condominium, which in many cases condos can look very much like a single-family detached home in terms of having sort of separate independent dwelling units where the occupants own their rooftop and are able to easily install solar PV. The non-residential breakdown on the bottom, first we kind of divide among these kind of three primary groupings, where we show that about half of all non-residential systems installed last year were at some sort of for-profit commercial property. And the pie chart breaks that out further. Retail, industrial, office, and warehouse buildings were kind of the largest individual commercial property types there. In the figure on the left, you can see that about a third and a growing portion of non-residential systems are in the agricultural sector. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but just to foreshadow one of the findings there, these are not large, ground-mounted agricultural arrays. For the most part, these are relatively small systems installed on what are presumably family farms, running residential loads as well as maybe pumping and fan loads or other kinds of equipment associated with the farming operations. And then the remainder of the non-residential sector consists of systems installed by tax-exempt customers. And so these are schools, government, houses of worship, other kinds of nonprofit entities. Here we provide a little bit more information for non-residential systems broken out into these different sectoral groupings. The figure on the top shows differences in system size. The three bars on the left-hand side are for our kind of three primary non-residential segments: commercial, agricultural, and tax-exempt customers. And then we show further to the right kind of some of the key sub-segments within the commercial and tax-exempt sectors. And there you can see, again, as I mentioned on the last slide, that most of these agricultural systems are pretty small, median size of just 12 kilowatts. The largest non-residential systems tend to be installed in government and on government properties and at schools, with median sizes up above 150 kilowatts. The figure on the bottom shows third-party ownership rates across these different sectors. And there we can see much higher rates of third-party ownership by tax-exempt customers, particularly government and schools. And this really just reflects historically that the tax benefits could be monetized really only through third-party ownership. Now with direct pay as an option, we might expect to see some kind of diminished usage of third-party ownership by tax-exempt entities. That will certainly be a trend that we keep an eye out in the year and years ahead. So with that, I'm going to now kind of turn to the other kind of key part of tracking the sun, which is trends in installed prices. And before getting into the data, I want to just run through some important kind of caveats and kind of explanatory notes so that we're all clear about what these data actually mean, what they represent. So first, I'll just note that unless otherwise noted, the data here are really focused on standalone PV systems, so not paired PV plus storage. We have excluded third-party ownership or third-party owned systems from this installed pricing analysis. And that's largely because the installed price data for those systems is not really kind of strictly comparable to what installed prices mean in the case of a host-owned system. For those host-owned systems, what these installed prices represent is whatever that host customer paid for the system before any incentives. These numbers are self-reported by the installers and customers, and so there's inevitably some kind of amount of noise in the data. One source of noise, I suppose, is inconsistency in what is actually included in that total price. And for systems that are loan financed, the installed prices, in many cases, we expect to include dealer fees. So this is some sort of loan financing fee that is passed through from the loan provider through the installer and to the customer, and is just rolled into that overall installed price. There are other kind of ancillary items that sometimes might be included, including repairs to the roofing, electrical repairs, other sort of parts of installing the PV system that might not kind of be strictly part of the system itself, but are nevertheless part of the job and part of what the customer pays. Also note here that the prices are adjusted for inflation. So here we can see long-term trends in median installed prices. You can see over the last decade or so, prices in all three sectors have been falling at a relatively steady rate of about 10 to 20 cents per watt per year. Prior to that, there was, as you can see, this period of very steep price declines, kind of in the middle of the time period shown. And those steep historical price declines really were driven by steep declines in global module prices. And you can see that in the figures on the bottom, where we provide some kind of component level details, and the lines with the solid circles there show how module prices really fell quite precipitously over about a 4 or 5 year period. And that in turn translated into those steep declines in system level prices that we see in the figures at the top. But since then, prices have been falling at a much slower pace, and those price declines have really been driven by declines in what we call soft costs or other kinds of balance of systems and business process related costs. And you can see those costs are represented also in the figures at the bottom by the solid lines there, where you can see how those costs have been falling steadily over time and now represent really the overwhelming share of the total installed price of distributed PV systems. That's true across the board, but especially in the residential sphere. Now here we drill in a little bit more, zoom in into the last couple of years, where we do so in part just because the last few years have been somewhat unusual. We've had very high rates of inflation, and with that, prices for just about everything has been going up. And so the figures on the top show changes in quarterly installed prices over the last 3 years. This is more or less the 3-year period where inflation rates were historically relatively high. And you can see for all 3 sectors that nominal installed prices rose over this period as a result of rising inflation, but real inflation-adjusted prices fell. They fell by about 50 cents a watt for residential systems and for closer to 10 cents a watt for non-residential systems over this roughly 3-year period. And so the fact that real prices fell, that just suggests that PV system pricing has, at least thus far, been less impacted by inflation compared to other consumer goods. You can see that more explicitly in the figure at the bottom, where we show the CPI inflation rate in the black line compared to the rise in nominal install prices. And so you can see how install prices have risen nominally at a slower pace than inflation. Perhaps just as importantly, as we show in the light gray line in that bottom figure, PV pricing has been rising slower than average retail electricity prices, which for many customers is kind of the relevant point of comparison when evaluating the economics of investing in PV. So the figure here just compares our median install prices to a number of other PV pricing benchmarks out there. There are a number of other prominent reports that provide regular data on the price of distributed PV systems. And in general, not in all cases, but in most cases, the prices that we report in Tracking the Sun are higher than what many of these other industry reports provide. And there are a number of different sort of apples to oranges types of reasons for that. One is, as I mentioned earlier, the installed prices that we're reporting include, in many cases, kind of ancillary items related to a PV installation, roof repairs, electrical repairs, that sort of thing. Whereas in many cases, the other benchmark prices that you might be used to seeing reflect kind of a more standard turnkey type of installation. There's also loan financing fees, which, as I mentioned, can be a pretty significant fraction of the overall installed price, at least for loan finance systems. Unfortunately, we don't have much visibility into that, but we know just from kind of looking at the loan terms that are currently being offered that it could be anywhere from 5% up to in extreme cases as much as 50% of the kind of cash purchase price that gets added on in the form of a loan fee. Everything up to this point in the installed price data has focused on standalone PV. Here we look at trends for paired PV plus storage systems. The figures on the top show trends in the overall installed price for paired PV plus storage systems. You can see that at least for residential and large non-residential, the median prices have been going down. That, of course, partly, or I would say maybe largely reflects trends in the underlying cost of PV as opposed to storage. The figure on the bottom instead focuses just on the storage-related costs, and that data that we show in the bottom figures, that's based on just information from California's self-generation incentive program. So this is just, kind of a slice of the market, not necessarily indicative of the market as a whole. But we do, at least from that particular source, have kind of storage-specific costs. And you can see in the residential sector that those storage-related costs have actually been rising over time. In the non-residential sector, it's been a little bit more flat. I'd also mention that later on in the report, we provide kind of a multivariate regression analysis where we try to statistically isolate the effect of different factors on the overall installed price of PV systems. And in that analysis, we estimate how big of a bump in the installed price you get if you add storage to a residential PV system. And in that analysis, just to kind of foreshadow the findings there, we find that adding storage to residential PV entails about somewhere between a $750 to $1,000 per kilowatt hour increase in the price of the system. That's a little bit lower than the numbers that we show on the slide here. And that may reflect just differences in the underlying sample or differences in how the storage-specific costs are being reported here. Now, I've been talking mostly about trends in median prices, but installed prices vary tremendously from project to project. And the figures here show the distribution in installed prices for projects installed last year, and you can see just this tremendous spread. Looking at the residential systems, even though the median price was up around $4 a watt, about 20% of systems were installed for less than $3 a watt, and 20% of systems had prices reported above $5.50 a watt. So just tremendous spread. Throughout the report, we dig into really a small subset of the different factors that contribute to that pricing variability. And I'll quickly talk about a couple of those. So first is just differences in system sizing. We saw earlier that there's quite a bit of variation in system sizes, even among residential systems. Here you can see that median installed prices vary by about $1 a watt between the smallest residential systems and kind of larger non-residential systems up above 12 kilowatts. So that's certainly an important contributor. On the non-residential side, differences in system sizing are even more significant given the even wider variation in non-residential system sizes. There's quite a bit of variation in pricing across states. You can see, for example, looking at the residential figure, a difference of about $2 a watt between the lowest and the highest priced states last year. Some of that can just be kind of idiosyncratic issues with the data, but some of it also reflects more kind of structural, fundamental features of these different state markets in terms of the market and policy conditions in each state and cost of living and the cost of goods in different states. The later regression analysis will dig into some of those details as well. Pricing also varies from installer to installer. The line here, each dot on the line shows the median reported price for an individual installer. We're focusing here on just the top 100 residential installers last year, sorted from lowest to highest median price. And you can see, a lot of variation across different installers. Some of that just reflects differences in where those installers operate, whether they're primarily operating in lower or higher cost parts of the country, but it also reflects different kind of firm level features. One possible firm level feature is how much experience the firm has. Have they been around a long time? Have they gotten efficient at installing PV systems. The analysis that we show later on, unfortunately, suggests that that does not really contribute very significantly to this installer level variation. But this is an area that we continue to explore, and there are all sorts of interesting hypotheses for why installer pricing might differ from one company to another. And then lastly here, we just show differences across the three primary non-residential sectors. And the main point that I want to illustrate here is that prices for tax-exempt systems or systems installed by tax-exempt customers tend to be higher than for other non-residential customer types. And that those differences are most obvious for the larger non-residential systems, and especially in the case of California, where you can see almost a $2 per watt difference in the median installed price for tax-exempt systems versus for-profit commercial systems last year. And those differences could reflect a number of different factors. Tax-exempt customers, again, these are a lot of government and school facilities. They may have more complex procurement processes. They may have more strict requirements related to domestically manufactured products or prevailing wages. They also tend to have greater prevalence of shade and parking structures, and that adds to the cost as well. So with that, I just really quickly, because I want to make sure we have at least 10 minutes for Q&A, I want to just run through some of the high-level findings from this regression analysis. So each year, as part of Tracking the Sun, we update this multivariate statistical analysis where we try to isolate the effect of different factors on the overall pricing variability for residential systems. And the table here just lists the different factors that we consider. The R squared at the bottom shows what fraction of the overall variability we are able to explain. It's a small fraction, but nonetheless, many of the variables we are able to estimate their impact with a very high level of statistical significance, and that gives us confidence that we at least understand how those particular factors impact pricing variability. So the figure here, it just tries to kind of boil this all down graphically in order to show which of these system level features have the biggest impact on prices. You can see that battery storage has the largest effect. On average, it increases system prices by about $1.40 per watt of PV. You can also see big impacts in the case of new construction, so PV installed on new homes. Those systems are about 70 cents per watt less expensive when controlling for everything else. You can also see pretty big variation based on system size. Again, about a 70 cent per watt difference between relatively small and relatively large residential systems. You can see that the market-related factors and the installer-related factors all have pretty small effects. And then lastly, that wide gray bar at the bottom for the state fixed effects, that just illustrates that even after controlling for all of the other factors listed above, there is still a really wide variability in pricing across states. And that wide variability reflects other state-specific or state-correlated factors that we haven't accounted for here, may be related to the details of the interconnection or permitting processes in each state, as well as potentially the cost of living and cost of goods in each state. So clearly a lot of other factors contributing to pricing variability above and beyond what we've shown here. So with that, I'm going to close out the presentation. We've got exactly 10 minutes left for Q&A. And hopefully, Naeem, you've been in the background there, and we've got some questions queued up.
Indeed, we do have a few, but not too many. So please go ahead and enter questions in the Q&A by just clicking on that little Q&A button at the bottom. So one which I've answered publicly, but should reiterate: will these slides be available for us to download? Yes. So these are a subset of the slides for the full report, which is itself in slide form, as Galen mentioned. So at trackingthesun.lbl.gov, so the link that's right here, you will be able to download the slides. So one question, are there trends or data analysis provided in the report to demonstrate the rest of the states, basically the country minus California?
So, I mean, within the report, the report really is the set of slides that I just presented. And so there's not much more in the report beyond just additional kind of background information on the data and some of the data cleaning steps that we conduct. But we have this wonderful data visualization tool that we have made available online. And if you go to trackingthesun.lbl.gov, you'll be able to find the link there to the data visualization tool. And with that tool, you can easily pull up trends for any state or any group of states that you desire, assuming, of course, we have data for them. So I would say, for folks who are looking for the data broken out in ways that we haven't done in the report, please do take a look at that data visualization tool. It's a great resource and is really intended specifically for that purpose. If that doesn't get you what you want, then we have our public data file. And this is the data file containing, however many millions of individual PV systems. We can't provide data for every system. Some of the data we obtain, we get through confidentiality agreements, and some of the particular pieces of information we can't share. But we do have this public data set where you can load up the data and really do whatever analysis you like with it. It's a huge data set, and so there is some challenge to working with a data set of that size. But we make that available for folks who are interested in going even deeper than what you can do with the data visualization tool.
Great. So one question, do you have a guess about what contributes to the variability in price across states after controlling for other factors?
Yeah, so I kind of rushed through this a little bit at the end. I think certainly differences in cost of living. So here, let me just take this opportunity to present this slide actually, which I skipped over. And so here we show the state fixed effects for each individual state. And so what these numbers, these are the dark green bars, represent is the difference in average price relative to California in each of these states after controlling for all of the other variables in the regression analysis. And so you can see here that, usually in most of these states, the fixed effect is somewhere between plus and minus 50 cents a watt. So in other words, after controlling for these other factors, there's still, upwards of plus or minus 50 cents a watt difference in pricing across states. And I think, probably one of the most likely explanations is differences in just the cost of living and cost of goods across states. In some states, things just cost less. And that may be contributing to some of, a big part of this difference. Incentives, including retail rates, can differ across states. And so where there are relatively rich incentives, installers may be able to charge higher prices and still, be able to sell the volume of systems that they're looking to sell. So that's another factor. And then I would say, kind of regulatory processes and sort of how cumbersome those is kind of another category of factors. And so that might include permitting and interconnection related processes, inspections, applying for and receiving rebates, Many of those administrative costs, those can vary quite a bit from state to state, and can cause a barrier to entry that might sort of secondarily increase prices if just fewer contractors are interested in entering the market. So those are my best ideas without having thought about it further or explored it further. But certainly we would welcome suggestions from any of you in terms of other hypotheses that you might have.
So we have a question just on data collection, I guess, why we don't have data for all states. I mean, this person asked in particular for Florida and Hawaii, but generally, why is it that we only have data for some states?
So most of the data that we collect for this report, we get from either utilities who are collecting this data through their interconnection process, or state agencies who are administering some sort of incentive program and are collecting this data through that process. And obviously, in both cases, a key requirement is that they're willing to share the data with us. And so it's, it requires establishing a relationship with an individual entity. And I think for some of the smaller states, it's been challenging to make those kind of connections, and we haven't really had the ability to sort of identify who's the right person to actually provide the data. But another factor is, in many cases, the data that's being collected just really isn't sufficient for our purposes. And so one threshold that we apply when looking to acquire new data is, are they collecting either pricing data, battery storage data, or address data? And like those are the three kind of key value add data fields. And so if a particular entity doesn't have any of those pieces of information, then it's frankly often just not worth sort of the effort on our part to collect and clean the data, because it wouldn't get used in most of our analysis. And so we want to make sure that the data we're collecting, that it actually finds its way into the figures in our report. And so those three fields that I mentioned are really the key ones to make sure that the data actually ends up getting used somewhere.
Great, and we only have a couple of minutes and probably, well, definitely more questions that we can answer. So picking a couple here. So do you know the breakdown of PV module product type in the commercial sector? For commercial rooftop systems, are bifacial modules being used, or are lighter weight products being favored? You can answer. I'm happy to answer the data piece as well.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and
Sure.
answer
So no, we don't look at this breakdown in particular. That said, as Galen mentioned earlier, you can download the data that's behind a lot of these figures. In there, we do have technology type, and you could then therefore do kind of your own analysis looking at the commercial sector, even what type of commercial sector in some cases, and the technology type. So this is another plug to download and play with the data. It's more than 4 million systems. You can't download it and open it in Excel, but you can use your favorite data and analysis software.
Yeah. And I would just to piggyback on that a little bit, one of the value adds with our data set is that we, and Naeem in particular, cleans and standardizes the module manufacturer and model and inverter manufacturer model names as well. And so, and then links that up with some kind of public sources of spec sheet data. And so, if you are looking to sort of analyze trends in module and inverter technology, at least as far as it relates to kind of manufacturer and model type, our data set is pretty well suited to doing that, since we've gone through the trouble of standardizing the spellings for all of these different products. Okay, so we are at the top of the hour here, so I'm gonna close things out. I guess I will maybe before officially closing everything out, I'll just mention one last thing, which is, again, this trackingthesun.lbl.gov website at the top here, that is the portal that you can go to find a recording of the webinar, the report, the data viz, the data set. There is also there a link where you can submit questions or make requests of us. And so one of the things we want to make sure to ask of all of you is, if you have ideas or suggestions for how we could improve this report in future years, we would very much welcome that. And through this web address at the top, you can hopefully find the link to submit those suggestions. So definitely encourage you to do so. You're also welcome to email either Naeem or myself if you have any follow-up questions or suggestions based on the webinar here today. So with that, I will thank all of you for joining. We really appreciate you spending the time here with us, appreciate your attention, and very much look forward to you joining us on webinars in the future. Thanks again. Have a good day. Bye-bye.